everyone, I'm Katrina, and as I'm sure a lot of you know, I love listening to audiobooks. In 2017 I listened to 14 audiobooks, which was 24% of my total reading, so it's a decent chunk. I listened to some pretty fantastic audiobooks last year and I wanted to highlight some of my favorites. So today I'm going to be talking about the top 5 audiobooks I listened to in 2017, and these aren't necessarily published in 2017, they're just the ones I listened to that year. Gemini by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff, which has a cast of narrators, as well as sound effects. One of the awesome things that we see in Gemini in particular is a song. In Gemini there is a song that is playing that starts to annoy some of the characters, and we kind of see some of the lyrics throughout the book, but obviously reading the physical book you can't hear such things. But in the audiobook they made the lollipop song, and it was pretty awesome. I think that listening to Gemini and just the Illuminae Files series as a whole is a really accessible way to consume the story. If you find that reading the physical book is a little bit hard to get into considering the format, perhaps give the audiobooks a try. These books are presented as a dossier, so they have different formats such as instant messages, emails, video transcripts. There's a lot of really unique playing with line and space on the page as well, which was really cool. Listening to the audio, you don't necessarily get the whole experience because there are illustrations and blueprints and things like that which aren't obviously described in the audio format, but again, listening to the audiobook you do get something out of it that you don't necessarily get in the physical book as well. If you're able to read and listen to these books, I would recommend doing both. You get something different out of the experiences from either format. Whichever way you consume the story, it is enjoyable, so fantastic, would recommend. I listened to both The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss, books 1 and 2 of the Kingkiller Chronicles, and these were narrated by Rupert Degas. I thought the narrator had such a versatile voice and did a fantastic job of bringing not only the story but the characters to life as well. I love when narrators are able to do really subtle changes with their voices to differentiate between different characters and different ages in their life as well, and sometimes it can feel overdone and kind of gimmicky, but I thought Rupert Degas did a fantastic job. The Kingkiller Chronicles is one of my favorite series of all time, so there was a pretty good chance that I was going to enjoy listening to the audiobook, and I think my expectations were met and exceeded with the narrator. In terms of the story itself, I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading these books for the first time on audiobook. I only say this because I personally avoid reading high fantasy stories for the first time by listening to the audiobook, and this is because there's so much world building and so much information that you're being given, and it can be a little more dense than, say, a contemporary story. So I find that you really need to be focusing 100% while listening to audiobooks, and I typically listen to audiobooks while I'm doing other tasks. If I'm driving, I'll often listen to an audiobook, and that does require brain work. I need to be focused on the road as well. So generally, I just, as a blanket rule, avoid listening to high fantasy stories, at least for the first time. If you do listen to a lot of high fantasy stories and it's not a problem for you, then absolutely 100% I would recommend listening to these if you haven't already. The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzie Lee was narrated by Christian Colson. This story and the characters, there is so much wit and so much humor, and I found that the main character had a really strong narrative voice, so listening to the audiobook for this one was an absolute delight. If I'd read this book in the physical form, I think that I would absolutely have still enjoyed it, but I suspect I wouldn't have enjoyed the experience quite as much as actually listening to the audiobook. So I'm really glad that I ended up listening to Gentleman's Guide. I just had such a fun time listening to it. I really enjoyed the experience and I kind of want to re-listen to it. I'm not really tempted to read the physical book if I reread it. I think I might just stick with the audio. The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater was narrated by Will Patton, and he has such a lovely, smooth southern accent. At the start I was actually a little bit hesitant about his voice and the accent, but I actually really grew to love it, and I think that his voice added so much atmosphere to the story. I felt like I was really in the south of America, so that was just an element that I thought really benefited the listening experience. Will Patton also does a really good job of differentiating between the different characters with their dialogue by just tweaking his voice really subtly. He does speak at a bit of a slower pace, especially in comparison to other narrators that I've come across, so I did speed up the audiobook more than I normally would, and that's not a pro or a con in any way. It's just a fact that I thought I'd mention. The last books that I'm going to be talking about are Sleeping Giants and Waking Gods by Sylvain Neuvel, which also has a cast of narrators. I think just across the board I've had a really good experience with audiobooks that do have multiple narrators. I think that for Sleeping Giants and Waking Gods in particular, the format of the book really lends to the audio format. It is set up as interviews, so you have these two people in dialogue talking back and forth. It's about these characters talking about what has happened. So I thought that worked really good for audio, and again, even better having multiple narrators. In terms of the story as well, it was just incredibly gripping. There's a lot of mystery and suspense and tension, so it really does force you to focus on the story. Like, I didn't find my mind wandering, which can sometimes happen in lull moments, but constantly throughout these books, I was attentive and I was wanting to know what would happen next. And for me, these were on the same level as the Illuminae Files audiobooks. They are some of my absolute favorite audiobooks of all time, and so I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed listening to Sleeping Giants and Waking Gods. So those were my favorite audiobooks that I listened to in 2017. In this video, I wanted to focus more on the actual listening experience with these audiobooks and how I thought the narrator did. So if you are interested in any of the books that I mentioned today and you aren't super familiar with the stories, I will have links down below to all of the Goodreads pages. If you enjoy listening to audiobooks, I would love to hear about any recommendations that you have. Are there any recent favorites? Tell me down below. But thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon in a new video. Until then, I'll talk to you in the comments. Bye!